Thank you, Trinita. When Trinita and I were in graduate school, we had a professor who told us that our PhD oral exams were to prepare us for the day that we might be called upon to perform emergency art history, on the off chance that we had to stand in for a colleague. And while I'm deeply sorry that Janet Robson couldn't be with us today, I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to pinch hit for her. As Trinita mentioned, I've spent much of my career contemplating the Benedictines, who, frankly, found the Mendicants to be a competitive nuisance, so much so that in 1419, they initiated an observant reform movement in Italy, in which the Florentine Benedictines played a key role. My current project has allowed me to think about the Mendicants, I can't even say Mendicants without thinking of Benedictines, from another more positive point of view, and I look forward to sharing some of that with you today. O you who enter the beautiful cemetery, looking at paintings with delight, lower your eyes to the dead figures below in the tombs of the excavated ground, and remember that which they were and that which you will become. This memento mori, or reminder of death, was recorded by the grain merchant Domenico Lenzi in a diary entry dated 1327. The poem bears witness to the concern borne by Renaissance Christians that they be prepared for death, just as the wise virgins in Matthew's gospel have plenty of oil for their lamps, ready to meet their bridegroom. Quote, "Watch therefore, for ye know neither the day nor the hour wherein the Son of Man cometh." Nope, not yet. The poem's verses further underscore that tombstones serve as the ultimate reminders of death, as long as one remembers to look down and contemplate what lies beneath. Our symposium and exhibition focus on the delights of painting and other artworks that adorned the walls and ceilings of mendicant churches. I would like to turn our attention to their floors, which during the Renaissance were carpeted with stone slabs, marking the final resting places of patrons who believed that burial by the mendicants was the greatest insurance for safe passage through purgatory and salvation at the final judgment. This notion is beautifully expressed in this extraordinary wall monument belonging to the cloth merchant Ubertino Bardi in his family's chapel at the Franciscan Friary of Santa Croce, where a personalized Last Judgment fills the wall framed by the casket's stone canopy. And you see a figure that we assume is the deceased appearing to rise out of his tomb with his hands put together in prayer. My story today comes from a broader research project involving a systematic analysis of all tombs installed in the city of Florence between the 13th and early 16th centuries. Through this work, I am seeking to answer the questions: how did Florentines decide on their final resting places? What led them to their choices about placement, form, and decoration? Looking at Florence's tombs broadly brings us closer to understanding how medieval Europeans experienced the deaths and memories of their kin, friends, competitors, and forebears. Florentine churches were filled with tomb markers and other commemorative decorations that, in the words of architectural historian Caroline Bruzelius, quote, encrusted them inside and out with the paraphernalia of death like barnacles on a pier. Florentines were keenly aware of the symbolic power of place in their city, and burial location was one of the most important choices they would make. The city was divided up into about 60 parishes, most of which were tightly packed in the old city center, as you see indicated with very tiny numbers on this map. That the parish was an integral part of a Florentine citizen's civic identity is made clear by the fact that legal and financial documents identified people and property according to the parish that contained them. The communal government, however, divided the city differently, first into 6 districts, or sestieri, and then, after 1343, reorganized into 4 quarters, each named after its primary church: the Augustinian Santo Spirito across the river to the south, the Dominican Santa Maria Novella to the west, the baptistry connected to the Cathedral of San Giovanni to the north, and the Franciscan Friary of Santa Croce at the east. And each of these quarters was further subdivided into 4 districts. So Florentines had 2 ways of identifying themselves, as it were, both with their district, or gonfalone, as it was called in Italian, and of course with their parish. While most Florentines were buried in their home parishes, after the Franciscans and Dominicans established communities on opposite sides of the city in the 13th century, increasing numbers of citizens requested entombment with the Mendicants. It should be noted that they also pursued burial in monasteries and the cathedral. Doing so caused tension with local parish churches that relied on burying their dead as a steady source of income. For example, in a tax return filed in 1427, the parish priest of San Donato dei Vecchietti, highlighted here in red at the right of the map, lamented that his parishioners regularly chose to be buried by the Dominicans at Santa Maria Novella, the much larger church highlighted here in blue, and thereby impoverishing the poor little parish. Even the Vecchietti themselves, who had endowed the high altar of the little church that bore their family's name, installed 3 tombs with the Dominicans at Santa Maria Novella and another one with the Franciscans across town at Santa Croce. As the cost of endowing a tomb, funding masses, and other burial expenses, including fines for extra parochial burial, were fairly consistent, burial choice seems to have had more to do with beliefs about ensuring salvation, as well as desire to associate with particular kinfolk, neighbors, and colleagues. Burial choice also allowed families to establish multiple sites of memorialization to one's lineage, as seen most clearly through the many patrons, like the Vecchietti mentioned above, who installed independent tombs away from their parents, siblings, and other kinsmen. Here, starting at the upper left and moving clockwise, I show you some of the tomb monuments installed by the Ricci family at the Cathedral, the Benedictine Monastery of the Badia, and the Dominican Friary of Santa Maria Novella. Ricci family members also endowed tombs with the Franciscans at Santa Croce and the observant Dominicans at San Marco. Such sepulchralization of the Florentine cityscape transformed the topography of late medieval Florence. Beginning in the late 1200s, an ever-increasing number of Florentines chose to be buried either with the Franciscan community of Santa Croce on the city's east side, or with the Dominicans across town at Santa Maria Novella. Today, we will explore who these patrons were and why they chose to abandon their parishes in favor of the Mendicants. From the outset, Mendicants were seen as especially effective supplicants, though through their missions to engage with the public, both Franciscans and Dominicans offered prayer as a means to be in community with the faithful, and, like monks before them, their prayers were highly desired by lay people, who believed that these appeals would ease passage through purgatory and lead to salvation for their souls. Europeans had long relied on monastic prayer to allay fears of death, and reform orders, which strove to seek virtue and discipline and to root out corruption, were believed to be closer to God and therefore more effective in their petitions to him. With their added regulation of poverty and accessibility to urban populations, the Mendicants drew thousands to their churches, eager for intercession, especially after death. Sermons offered inspiration and education. Prayer offered comfort and hope. Traditionally, scholars have seen the Franciscans as appealing primarily to the lower levels of society, whereas Dominicans appealed more to the elite. In the case of Florence, at the turn of the 14th century, the social status of the Franciscan friars resident at Santa Croce and the Dominicans at Santa Maria Novella seemed to confirm this dichotomy, as demonstrated by the historian Daniel Lesnick in his 1989 book, preaching in medieval Florence, the social world of Franciscan and Dominican spirituality. Lesnick argued that the monastic populations in Santa Croce and Santa Maria Novella mirrored each order's primary constituency, with Franciscans appealing mostly to the so-called popolo minuto, which literally means the little people, but which today we would call the working class, artisans, craftsmen, shopkeepers, laborers, and recent immigrants to the city. While the Dominicans, Lesnick contended, appealed to the so-called popolo grasso, which literally you could translate as the fats. But again, we would call them today elites or the patriciate. And these were namely our merchants, bankers, doctors, lawyers, and judges. Through analysis of reconstructed membership rolls from the turn of the 14th century, Lesnick found that 43%, which you see here in blue, of Santa Maria Novella's friars had been born into Florentine families with surnames, most of whom came from the merchant banking class. And the red wedge are popolo minuto, or working class, and the green wedge represents immigrants. By contrast, only 14% of the friars minor at Santa Croce, quote, had their origins in society's uppermost ranks. And these, Lesnick noted, were primarily from the so-called magnate class, or old aristocracy, a group of elites who had been disenfranchised from political service and political participation after 1293. So they were wealthy, but they had little power. Thus, Lesnick deduced, quote, the Florentine social group, virtually unrepresented at Santa Croce, was the popolo grasso, the merchant banking ruling elite. This difference, Lesnick argued, explains distinctions in how Franciscan and Dominican preachers addressed their audiences and recruited new members. The friars minor, quote, in both membership and audience, oriented overwhelmingly toward the humbler popolo, that is, artisans, minor professionals, and recent immigrants, and the friars preachers to the, quote, elite merchant banker popolo grasso. This characterization has had a broad and lasting influence since its publication over 25 years ago. From mendicant studies to general histories to books and articles on topics as diverse as Dante's knowledge base, Chaucer's social commentary, Petrarch's humanism, and even Luca Pacioli's treatise on bookkeeping, Lesnick's work has become a go-to source for understanding the social composition of the Franciscan and Dominican communities in 14th century Florence. Some critics, however, have taken issue with Lesnick's rather dualistic approach, noting in book reviews that each church found members of the working class, the merchant banking elite, and the older aristocracy within their lay audiences, who often blended Franciscan and Dominican pieties in their devotional practices, writings, and art commissions. And we saw some of that blending in the two papers this morning. Here you see, for example, on the left, a Cavalcanti family tomb at Santa Maria Novella, one of 12 family monuments installed there. And on the right, we see a Cavalcanti tomb at Santa Croce, one of 14 that members of this very large clan, I should tell you, put in that church. One source of evidence for the social makeup of the Florentine, Franciscan, and Dominican communities, untapped either by Lesnick or his critics, is the patronage profile of the numerous individuals who commissioned tombs and other commemorative markers inside these monastic compounds, a much larger number than those who chose to profess as friars. A comparison of the families responsible for carpeting the interiors and covering the exteriors of Santa Croce and Santa Maria Novella with tombs shows much more similarity than difference between the social profiles of mendicant patrons. Looking at their memorials not only gives us a view of the regular interchange between wealthy lay people and humble friars and the resulting transfer of wealth from donors to convents, but also reminds us that mendicant churches were in many respects dominated by the dead, whose tombs, banners, and coats of arms served to remind the living to pray for them, while also preparing themselves for the afterlife. To date, Florence's memorial culture has been known primarily through the extraordinary Renaissance wall monuments made for elites, humanists, and high-ranking clerics, like the tomb of Pope John XXII, made by Donatello and Michelozzo, For the baptistry around 1427, which you see on the left, the monument to Piero and Giovanni, sons of Cosimo de' Medici, created by Andrea del Verrocchio in 1469 for their parish church of San Lorenzo, which you see on the right, or the tombs of Leonardo Bruni and Carlo Marsupini, installed at Santa Croce in the mid-15th century by Bernardo Rossellino and Desiderio da Settignano, respectively. These find precedent in medieval wall tombs known as arche or avelli, numerous examples of which can be found both inside and out at Santa Maria Novella, Santa Croce, the Vallombrosan Monastery of Santa Trinita, the Badia Fiorentina, and other Florentine churches. However, starting in the 14th century, it was floor slabs belonging to the city's commercial class that came to dominate Florence's memorial culture. Large rectangular slabs, typically of marble, averaging 9 feet long and 5 feet wide, with coats of arms, inscriptions, and occasional portrait sculpture, carpeted the churches of late medieval Florence in every precinct of the city. The walls and floors of crypts, cloisters, and cemeteries also contained tombs carrying the signs and names of Florentine citizens. Members of the cloth, wool, silk, linen, and banking industries, as well as judges, lawyers, doctors, and notaries, and I should also say artisans and innkeepers and all kinds of folks, sought to mark out private space in their city's churches and cemeteries, not simply for burial, but also to honor and remember their lineages for generations to come. Just as these men filled the halls of government and places of business in life, their tomb markers covered the floors and walls of parish, mendicant, and monastic churches in death. While proper burial was a crucial step in preparation for the afterlife, tomb monuments manifest a complex and conflicting mix of piety and social calculation that reflect a tension between Christian humility and social recognition. Benefactors hoped to secure perpetual intercession for their souls while they preserved and promoted their family's honor. As art historian Doralyn Pines has noted in her work on the floor slabs of Santa Croce, quote, "If the deceased had been concerned only for his soul, he would have given a donation to the church of which only he and the clerics would have been aware. Along with the chapels, altars, pulpits, water fonts, altar cloths, and other liturgical objects that could be emblazoned with coats of arms and family names, tombs encouraged recognition and remembrance. Social historian Samuel Cohn aptly calls tombs, quote, sacred niches of family pride, end quote, while the economic historian Richard Goldthwaite notes that they were, quote, for the soul and the ego, not to mention the body, in both this world and the next. Lay tombs were a ubiquitous reminder of Florence's past and offered promise of a glorious future through the honorees' descendants still walking and working in the city. The 13th and 14th centuries saw a boom in tomb production and indoor burial. In Florence, merchants and other professionals installed their monuments alongside the tombs of clerics and civic heroes. Here, we are looking at the, what you might call ownership of the southern end of the transept at Santa Croce. Within the basic format of the rectangular stone slab, you see variations of color, size, and ornament. 6 of these tombs shown here carry effigies of the deceased. Though all clearly wealthy enough to install monuments in the transept of one of Florence's major churches, these patrons represent a variety of social groups. As expected, they all have last names, and I should tell you that most of the artisan class would only be known by their name and their father's name. So already, if you have someone with a last name, that suggests that they have a degree of social status. So all of these tomb owners have family names, which does indicate that. If we start along the left-hand side of this slide, lining the steps that border the transept chapels, we see merchants and bankers, followed by a jurist, a knight, a family of butchers who became bankers in their later generations, and 2 notaries. Bankers, jurists, and merchants, as well as a soldier and a friar who had the extraordinary opportunity to be buried separately from his humble Franciscan brethren in the communal tomb, similarly filled the second and third rows of the south transept. By subsuming places of honor formerly reserved for ecclesiastics, soldiers, and saints, lay people transformed the cityscape of late medieval Florence by filling church interiors with their monuments. This resulting topography of tombs demonstrates an intense parceling of church property into private memorials to individual businessmen and their families. Unfortunately, the surviving evidence does not always allow us to determine the identity, social status, or occupation of particular owners. Tomb registries, which are known as sepultuari, were kept as a means to keep track of who was buried where and when tombs changed hands. Tombs were most typically passed down through the generations of a family, and multiple burials would happen within the same tomb. In fact, many of them had lots and lots of bodies put inside of them. But these tombs were often regularly recycled, with ownership transferring from one family to another when lineages died out or could no longer afford to keep them. Often, inhabitants were forgotten to the ravages of time, weather, and foot traffic. When custodians lost track of who owned a certain tomb, they would leave the relevant sepultuario entry blank, assess its condition as consumata, or worn away, and note the lack of certainty as to who was buried therein, sometimes with the entry of, quote, non si sa di chi sia, we don't know whose it is. If church officials and antiquarians were at a loss to identify a tomb's owner, it is that much harder for historians to do so now. Renovation, repaving, and, in the case of Santa Maria Novella, the fabrication of neo-Gothic tombs in the mid-19th century have further disrupted medieval burial grounds, and the sepultuari make us regretfully aware of the numerous tombs, especially those in outdoor cemeteries, that are all but gone, save occasional fragments. Tomb registries typically list the owner of a tomb, though not necessarily its original founder, a brief description of its form, and reference to the inscriptions it carried with varying degrees of accuracy. For example, here I show you an entry from one of these sepultuari. Gherardino di Giano installed a tomb for himself and his children in the crypt of Santa Croce, the Franciscan friary, as recorded in a tomb registry written in Latin on parchment in the early 14th century. This record only gives us Gherardino's name, and it says, Sepulchrum Gherardini Giannis et filiorum, the tomb of Gherardino, son of Gianni, and his sons. We do know that Gherardino belonged to at least one guild or professional association because he was elected to the communal government of Florence 5 times before 1332. He lived with his family in the Oltrarno district in the parish of San Niccolò, and you see here his neighborhood highlighted in green, and the church of San Niccolò has a little red star there, littler than I wanted, sorry, but hopefully you can see that, it's right there. In choosing Santa Croce as his final resting place, Gherardino was abandoning his home parish and incurring additional fees for his burial, as the Franciscans would have to turn over 1/4 of these funds to San Niccolò. Moreover, Gherardino's choice meant that his kin would have to travel along this route a greater distance to attend his funeral and those of his kinfolk who were also buried in the family tomb. This may, however, have been seen as advantageous, for the longer the funeral procession, the greater the recognition, attention, and opportunity for intercessory prayer. More information on this particular tomb comes from a late 16th century tomb registry, which added the date of 1334 and the fact that the family had acquired a surname, Gianni, after Gherardino's father, as well as a coat of arms, which was drawn in. It also records that the ownership of the tomb had passed to Gherardino's grandson, the cloth merchant Astore di Niccolo Gianni. The surviving tomb fragment, which is now installed into the wall of Santa Croce's significantly renovated crypt, so it's still in the general right place, but very different than what it would have looked like in the 14th century. This fragment seems to date to the early 18th century restoration of the tomb, as indicated by the lower inscription, where we see the date 1720. Astorre, together with his brother, by the year 1439 had also inherited rights to a tomb in Santa Croce's Isle, installed by his father and a cousin and renovated in the late 16th century. And you see that slab, which is still in its location here. In addition, Astorre, together with his wife, had dedicated a chapel with a tomb several decades earlier in the family parish church of San Niccolò. So it is unclear which of these three grave sites was used for Astorre's burial. This example is just one of many that reminds us to read tomb registries with care. Even so, a significant amount of information about who installed tombs in Santa Croce and Santa Maria Novella allows us to reconsider our assumptions about the social makeup of Franciscan and Dominican audiences in Florence. Santa Maria Novella had served as a parish burial site long before the arrival of the Dominicans in the early 13th century. As has been persuasively argued by the architectural historians Caroline Berzelius and Fritjof Schwarz, the new Dominican church was built in this location in phases on a plan designed to accommodate large numbers of individual tombs. In addition to drawing numerous patrons who chose to pay fines to their parishes for burial with the Dominicans, many tomb honorees were in fact from the neighborhood and may have had a longer-standing relationship with the location and its pre-existing cemeteries through parish burials dating as far back as the late 11th century. Of the 828 tombs known to have been installed at Santa Maria Novella prior to the early 17th century, 74% belonged to men with last names, seeming to confirm Lesnick's assertion that elites were drawn to the Dominicans. Of that group, 11% were magnates, that is, from the disenfranchised old aristocracy, while another 23% had entered the communal government prior to 1342, which earned them the distinction as popolani. And the Florentines are very into social status, and in addition to wealth, how old your family is another indicator, and how early you entered the communal government is another way of telling, whether you are all that, as we like to say today. And so these different wedges are telling you this is the earliest entry into the government and so on. But we have almost half of the tomb owners who never had any government service at all. And that doesn't mean they weren't wealthy or respected, it just meant that they didn't have the same level of social status. Though the number of tombs at Santa Croce was higher, over 1,100, the breakdown of tomb owners with and without surnames is remarkably similar to that of Santa Maria Novella, quite different from the distribution among the monastic population itself. And so here you can see that family names at Santa Croce, 86%, at Santa Maria Novella, 92%, so both really high percentages. Among the patrician owners at Santa Croce, 16% were magnates, and 24% had entered the government before 1342, which means that they were merchants, bankers, lawyers, all of those guys. Unlike the distribution differences among the friars at each house, where we see many more patricians at Santa Maria Novella, and a concentration of old aristocrats making up the relatively small group of elites at Santa Croce, the distribution of tombs at each convent is nearly identical. While there were more tombs belonging to members of the old aristocracy, both in absolute numbers and in percentage of the whole, at Santa Croce than we find at Santa Maria Novella, there were also a large number, in fact 3% more, of bankers, merchants, lawyers, and other popolo grasso buried within Franciscan walls, as seen in this view that I've already shown you of the south transept. If we drill down and look only at those tombs that can be securely dated to the period under Lesnick's review, that is, before the middle of the 14th century, the contrast between the populations of friars and populations of deceased is even more striking. The Franciscans, in fact, had more elite families represented through tombs than did the Dominicans. While the Dominicans do seem to have drawn more patrons with surnames than at Santa Croce, 253 of these families, or 65%, had little to no discernible social status before 1350. Indeed, the top tomb owners at each church were a mix of old aristocrats and self-made elites, bankers, merchants, lawyers, and notaries, as well as the occasional butcher, artisan, or shopkeeper. Thus, it seems that the Franciscans and the Dominicans both appealed to a wide cross-section of the Florentine populace. So how then did an individual decide where to install his tomb? And this is a question I can't really answer today. Why might I've got a little bit, but I don't have the whole answer. Why might a person prefer the Dominicans to the Franciscans or vice versa? And we have one extraordinary example that I want to follow up on. A woman named Margherita Manfredi, who was buried in the Dominican Church of Santa Maria Novella in 1370, but she requested in her last will and testament to be wearing a Franciscan habit. So, explain that one to me. Proximity to home may have been a factor. For example, the majority of tomb owners at Santa Croce came from the quarter of the same name, though frequently not from the parish. The next largest group of tomb owners lived in the neighboring districts of Vaio and Chiavi in the quarter of San Giovanni, and also from Scala across the river in the Oltrarno. Similarly, tomb owners at Santa Maria Novella came from its eponymous parish, while many more came from its home district of the White Lion, as well as elsewhere in the Santa Maria Novella quarter. The neighboring district, so there's the rest of the Santa Maria Novella quarter. The neighboring district of the Golden Lion in San Giovanni also provided a large number of constituents. However, each church had its share of tomb owners who came from all quarters of the city. Further complicating this picture is the fact that 97 different families installed tombs in both churches, and five of these families had sons profess at friars at each one. Covering their bases is what I'm guessing. While there may have been a significant difference, 29%, in the number of patricians who chose to profess as Dominicans rather than as Franciscans in the early 14th century, this study shows that the social world of Franciscan and Dominican tomb patronage was roughly equivalent. In the first half of the 14th century, there were in fact more elite-owned tombs at Santa Croce than at Santa Maria Novella. This profile remains consistent throughout the Republic, with the Dominicans coming to surpass the Franciscans only slightly by the early 17th century. A number of questions remain about how Florentines chose their tomb locations, but it is fair to say that elites were attracted in large numbers to both the Franciscans and the Dominicans, inviting the friars to care for their remains, praying and preaching for their salvation. Thank you.
If we have any questions for Ann later, I'll invite you up here to one of the microphones. And thank you for your talk.
Thank you, Anne, for a super talk. I wondered, do you get any sense of whether the interiors of churches, cloisters, crypts, whether there's a pattern to those distinct spaces in each convent, or does it vary in terms of desirability and prestige?
Yes. I'm gonna let me get a. Sorry, I have my one of my other advisors in grad school. His adage was, show them lots of pictures and change them often. Anyway, this slide shows a plan of Santa Maria Novella with part of a tomb map superimposed on top of it. So it's a little bit hard to read, but we are looking here at the so this is the high altar that had 5 tombs in it, and the 4 altar chapels, which had tombs clustered around them. So that's what we're looking at here. So definitely, actually, as Bruzelius has shown in her recently published book that Trinita mentioned in her introduction, location, not only which church you're choosing, but where in the church is very important. So initially, lay people were supposed to be buried outside, and really only the bishop, the pope, very special people got to be buried inside. But that starts to change in the 1200s, 1300s, and so we have this rush of people who want to get inside. And then once you get inside, it's very prestigious to be as close to the high altar as possible. So that's why we have so many tombs concentrated in the transept. But being near any altar is good, because all altars, as you know, have to have some relics in them to be consecrated. So being anywhere near holy ground, holy relics is good. Being in a doorway, believe it or not, is actually good, because that means you're getting lots of people walking by your tomb and presumably saying a quick prayer for you as they're walking over. And if any of you all have been to Santa Croce, which is one of the churches that actually retains some of its original appearance, because its tombs are many of them are still there, they are almost obliterated because of all the foot traffic that has gone over them. So there actually are a bunch of places that's good. We also see people wanting to be in the sacristy, people wanting to be in the chapter room, people wanting to be in the cloister right in front of the chapter room. I showed you all a flank of tombs at Santa Maria Novella. Those are right outside the chapter room, in between the monks, I'm sorry, they're not monks, the friar's door into the church to go to choir and the chapter room. So the friars are going to be passing by those tombs, 8 times a day at least. So they're also thinking about movement. We don't want to think about these as static. And then one thing that's really interesting, and I don't know the evidence beyond Santa Croce, but if any of you all are familiar with Sharon Strocchia's wonderful 1992 book on death and ritual, which studies the Renaissance funeral, there were banners and flags that would be emblazoned with your family coats of arms, maybe the stemma of the city, what guild you belong to. And the family flags were actually kept at the gravesite. So if anyone knows actually of a drawing or something that shows this, I'd love to see it. But Santa Croce originally had flags, probably installed in the piers or somehow stored at the burial site. So we want to also imagine this colorful interior, not just the frescoes, but these personal emblems that were near the tombs. And then when it was time for a funeral, the pallbearers would come and get these flags and take them to the house, and then they would be processed back. So lots of ways to draw attention to yourself, but definitely the closer to the high altar or any altar or some place where there's a lot of traffic. One thing about the exterior tombs, though, especially at Santa Maria Novella with those wonderful avelli that line the tomb, even though they're outside, those were very prestigious because they're so big and they face the city on 2 different sides. So, I still haven't completely teased out if there's a hierarchy per se. I think that it was definitely a choice, but it's not necessarily always that this one is the best and this one is the second best. But that was a really long answer to your question, but yes.
Hi, Anne. Thank you for your talk.
Thanks.
So to follow up on Donald's question, I would like to simply point out for this audience that the location of the tomb was not only in the transept, but the transept embraced the choir. Right, so the choir is in the center, and the power of mendicant prayer is precisely in that location. What becomes interesting from the point of view of an architectural historian is that as the building is constructed from that area of the choir towards the west end, there's less incentive to actually put a tomb there, right? You're not as close to that powerful prayer. And so I think many of these buildings should be understood as being built very episodically, very much contingent on who was given enough money, on the aggregation of enough donations. Those of us who work at universities know this problem very well. And that takes me back to Christine's wonderful talk from this morning, that the dating of these buildings is incredibly complicated because we tend to have maybe 1 or 2 documents, and we tend to associate the whole building with those documents, but in fact, those buildings, like Santa Croce here on the right, are often constructed over 150 years or more, and that work is very contingent on those donations. So what we have here is a wonderful economic system, right? A salvation for bucks, if I can put it that way. And it's a very interesting one because, frankly, what this might have meant was that these 2 orders, which are dedicated to apostolic poverty, right, are nonetheless surviving because of this system. and that if you were seriously poor, as Francis himself aspired to be, you would have had no place in being buried in these churches. Thank you.
And for those of you who don't know, that is Caroline Berzelius, who I have many footnotes to her wonderful book in my talk. But here we are looking, we're at the door, and this is looking towards the altar. And you see there are tombs, and there actually are, there's one here, there's one here, but they're much more concentrated. Here we are. So here's a nave pier, and we're by a holy water font. So again, that's a good place to be, right? People are doing that. But it's I want to go back to that wonderful aerial shot that I keep showing. So this is the transept. So you can see that they're much more, that's a different church, they're much more concentrated there we go, in the transept than they are in other places. So, yes.
Quick question. Wives, mothers, sisters of these bankers, and where are they?
Yeah, that's a great question. It may not shock you, but it's very rare, although we do have examples, of women who dedicated their own tombs, and it has their name on it and their family coat of arms, but usually they were put in their husband's tomb with no mention of their birth family. So not only is their identity really being obscured, but their origins are being obscured as well. And we do have cases where, and again, this is something I'd like to look into a little more. I'm just going to go back and show you one really special one of what negotiations were going into the wife's coat of arms being included as well. Usually it was because the wife's family was probably actually more prestigious than the husband's family, and so having her arms on the tomb, raises the profile. But women are often, there we go. Here's a really special one from the late 15th century where we see husband and wife lying on a marital bed for all eternity, which is pretty fantastic. This is from the Tedaldi family in Santa Croce. But mostly they are almost anonymous. Sometimes in the documents, they're just referred to as the wife of so-and-so. More often, they'll have their first name, but their married name. And really rarely, when that makes me really happy, they'll have their father and birth name as well as their own last name. But they do tend to get obscured. Now, if a woman was lucky enough to become a saint, then she would get her own tomb made for her. But we do have actually another Tedaldi family woman near this tomb. I don't have a picture of it. She does have a tomb, and it has her name on it, and I just don't know enough the circumstances of that woman as to why. She seems to have been the first person who died in that nuclear family, but it was pretty special for a woman to have her name on the tomb as well. Any other questions? Yeah. Is it time? I think someone just got up. Do we have time or no? You tell me. No, now she sat down. Okay, thank you. You can ask me afterwards.